appetite for beef and bread and cheese. But while I should resist the suggestion that we must eat beef without mustard, I do recognize that there is now a more subtle danger, that men may want to eat mustard without beef. I mean that they may lose their appetite for beef and bread and cheese, and depend entirely on spices and condiments. I myself have even been blamed for defending the spices of life against what was called the simple life. I have been blamed for making myself a champion of beer and skittles. Fortunately, if I was a champion of skittles, there was never any danger of my being a champion at skittles. Somehow I never could aim at skittles with that precision with which I could aim at beer. But I have played ordinary games like skittles, always badly. I have even played golf in Scotland before Arthur Balfour brought it to England, and it became a fashion, and then a religion.
Panama Hat, thank you so much for joining me for Lamster. Who was GK Chesterton?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Gilbert Keith Chesterton was, on a basic level, he was an English journalist who lived from the sort of late Victorian period to the mid-30s. And that's what he would have called himself. He always insisted on being called a journalist. Though, really, that there wasn't anything he didn't do as such. He wrote philosophy. He wrote many fantastic lay apologetics. Though he was never a clergyman. He was always a layman. He wrote art criticism. He wrote history. He wrote some amazing novels. He was a great poet. He was also one of the best radio broadcasters of his age. But unfortunately, the BBC has destroyed all but very few of the recordings of Chesterton, and he recorded hundreds of them over quite a few years.
That is tragic.
Yes, the BBC is notorious for it.
I wonder if during this stream we could remedy that by reading all of our Chesterton quotes in his voice.
Yes, perhaps so. Yes, and yes, he was extremely prolific in his time, and his influence has lasted. He was of course quite famously although I think his apologetics apply to a general defense of religion and of Christianity, he quite famously converted to Catholicism in 1922, and and then he was kind of known for his Catholic apologetics, even long before he made the conversion. Yes, and he's been given various honors by the church, I believe, because of his work in defending it. He was also known for being a very, very, very well-humored man, always laughing, always with a joke, and he has this great talent for. One for paradox. He was called the Prince of Paradox in his own lifetime, because he would kind of use these incredible literary paradoxes, these opposites, to prove a point. And also, he was known for his kind of physical character. He was a very large man. He stood at about, I think he was like 6'4", and very, very weighty. Very, 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 very large man, which he's kind of quite famous for. There are many incredible anecdotes about him, but there's several related to this. During the First World War, a lady in London asked him why he was not out at the front. And he said, "Madam, if you go around to the side, you will see that I am out at the front." Yes, and I believe it was his friend, but philosophical enemy, George Bernard Shaw, who people will have heard of, I think. Complete opposite to Chesterton, kind of, atheist, vegetarian, progressive, socialist type. And of course, it was even more funny because Shaw was extremely, extremely thin. And Chesterton once came up to Shaw and said, "To look at you, anyone would think a famine had struck England." And Shaw said, "Well, to look at you, I think you would have caused it." Yes, yeah,
Incredible.
yes, many great anecdotes. But yes, that's basically who GK Chesterton was.
I wonder if you would like to select an extract of some of his writing to kick us off. And if you would read it in your best Chesterton impression as well.
Yes, as we heard there.
Yes.
Yes. Well, the thing is, I've got so many here.
You've got so many to choose from.
I'm flicking through which one to read. Right, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the one about prohibition. I do actually. I know it quite well off by heart, but I'm just gonna check here.
It would be a travesty to misquote.
Yes, indeed. Oh gosh, where is it? Right. So Chesterton. I'll give some context here. Chesterton visited America twice during his life to give lecture tours. He was very popular in the United States and in Canada. And of course, when he went, it was the early 20s, and Prohibition was in full swing. And Chesterton, people look at him and assume he was probably kind of quite gluttonous, but it's actually not really the case. But he was very fond of his drink. He would drink. He loved sort of like beer and stout and all these sorts of these sort of wonderful English drinks. And he went to America and he realized that there was a loophole here, because while he couldn't drink in America, he was of course a citizen of Britain. And at that time, being a citizen of Britain meant you could enter any Commonwealth realm without having to show a passport. You could simply sort of go in. And of course, what's right next door to America is Canada. So what Chesterton would do is he would finish his lecture for that evening, get the train across the border to Canada, get absolutely sloshed in the pub in Canada, then get the train back into America and go to his hotel for the night. Yes. So, but yes, he says on prohibition, which he hated. He says, and I'll try and do the voice now. There is nothing quite as ridiculous as prohibition in America, the land of liberty, as they call it. To say that a man can vote for his president, but not what he has with his dinner, is like saying a man has a right to his hat, but not a right to his head. Yes, incredible.
It's these little comic turns of phrase, but they're more than comedy.
Yes.
There's something deeply.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost wielding humor as a proof of truth, isn't it?
Yes. This is it. It's almost mathematical in a certain way. The beauty of it.
So I called this stream "Arm Yourself with Chesterton." I didn't actually consult with you about whether that made sense. But
I like it. I like it.
In my mind, I think if you can go through life with key expressions from these thinkers at your behest, that you can just say them to yourself to remind yourself of some of the some of these truths. It's like the way it's been captured just makes it's like a weapon.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean it's and of course, as I said, he was a great poet, and I will read some of his poetry because it's incredible. And I think that ultimately, I've said in the past that when people like us think about philosophy and we're going to put what we think into words, we need to try to avoid writing these kind of huge academic tomes. Like we should really what you should do is boil down truth into the most concise kind of poetic framing as possible. That's really the skill of it. I mean, in a sense, that's what the Bible is to me. It's especially a version like the King James. It's a piece of poetry, really. It's the absolute truth distilled into poetic language. It's not this prescriptive, systematic, kind of rambling sort of Heideggerian text. It's concise.
Yes. I wonder We've had a question here. Please recommend a Chesterton poem for my channel. Maybe this is the time for a poetry recitation
Yes.
from you.
Now again, what are we going to choose here? I mean, he wrote hundreds of poems, pretty much all of which we still have, and they're free on the internet, by the way. Most of his work is out of copyright now. Well, what I'm going to do is, I think I've actually mentioned this one before. I'm going to read one of my favorite Chesterton poems. It's a very reactionary one, and it's all about the nature of these British Isles and the way that British people are, basically. And it contains basically a defense of doing things our way and not doing it anybody else's way. So it's called The Rolling English Road. And it goes like this. Before the Roman came to Rye or out to Severn strode, the rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road, a reeling road, a rolling road that rambles round the shire, and after him the parson ran, the sexton and the squire. A merry road, a mazy road, and such that we did tread, the night we went to Birmingham by way of Beachy Head. I knew no harm of Bonaparte and plenty of the squire, and so to fight the Frenchman I did not much desire, sorry. But I did bash their bagonets because they came arrayed to straighten out the crooked road an English drunkard made, where you and I went down the lane with ale mugs in our hands, the night we went to Glastonbury by way of Goodwin Sands. His sins they were forgiven him, or wider flowers run behind him, and the hedges all strengthening in the sun. The wild thing went from left to right and knew not which was which, but the wild rose was above him when they found him in the ditch. God pardon us, nor harden us, we did not see so clear, the night we went to Bannockburn by way of Brighton Pier. My friends, we will not go again, or ape an ancient rage, or stretch the folly of our youth to be the shame of age, but walk with clearer eyes and ears this path that wandereth, and see undrugged in evening light the decent inn of death. For there is good news yet to hear, and fine things to be seen, before we go to paradise by way of Kensal Green. Yes.
Amazing. Just a use of language which makes you fall in love with the English language, doesn't it?
The rolling English road. Yes.
Yeah. No, I think our audience will be familiar most with, well, I'm sure most people have come across Chesterton a bit, but we've had quite a focus on Carlyle of late in our midst. So I wonder if you could say a word or two about the comparison, the contrast, how do they relate to one another?
So, Thomas Carlyle and GK Chesterton, I mean, it's a very kind of awkward comparison in many ways. Now, Chesterton wrote a very large amount on the Victorian authors. That's Carlyle, Ruskin, Tennyson, etc., Walter Scott. Because, of course, to him, those were sort of that wasn't very long ago. You know, most of those men had only died within Chesterton's lifetime, and they had left an enormous influence on literature and Britain as a whole. And of course, as we know, Carlyle was this kind of ultra Protestant, kind of pessimistic. I suppose. You know, he was very kind of deeply serious in a way that Chesterton was extremely humorous. But they were, actually no, I'm wrong there, because I say that as if Chesterton wasn't serious. He was. He was just as serious as Carlyle was. He meant it. He meant it. And when you read a lot of what Chesterton wrote, it becomes clear that he could foresee this age that we live in now. He could see it. He could see very clearly it was coming, and he was warning against it for his whole life, basically. And I mean, really, I suppose in some ways they're preaching the same thing. Of course, you know, they're both Christian, both very well-read men. But at the same time, Carlyle is so militant in a way that Chesterton is sort of more in how he would treat the kind of the polity of Christendom and of England, for example. And Chesterton, he wrote quite a bit about Carlyle, and I mean, he also, but he blames Carlyle for, ironically, giving way to some progressivism. he actually thinks that Carlyle's love of German kind of systematic philosophy was one of his great failings. I think I'm trying to think what the quote was. Oh yes, here it is. It's the two primary things that I'll do the voice. The two primary things in Thomas Carlyle were his early Scotch education and his later German culture. The first was in almost all respects his strength, and the latter in some respects his weakness. As an ordinary lowland peasant, he inherited the really valuable historic property of the Scots, their independence and their fighting spirit, and their instinctive philosophic consideration of men merely as men. But he was not an ordinary peasant. If he had laboured obscurely in his village till death, he would have been yet a locally marked man, a man with a wild eye, a man with an air of silent anger. But while his fellow peasants would have seen this in him, and perhaps mocked it, they would have also seen something which they always expect in such men. They would have got it, vision, a power in the mind akin to second light. Like many ungainly or otherwise unattractive Scotchmen, he was a seer. By which I do not mean to refer so much to his transcendental rhapsodies about the world soul or the nature garment or the mysteries and eternities generally. These seem to me to belong more to his German side and to be a less sincere and vital. I mean a real power of seeing things suddenly, not apparently reached by any process, a grand power of guessing. He saw the crowd of the new States General, Danton with his rude, flattened face, Robespierre peering mistily through his spectacles. He saw the English charge at Dunbar. He guessed that Mirabeau, however dissipated and diseased, had something sturdy inside of him. He guessed that Lafayette, however brave and victorious, had nothing inside of him. He supported the lawlessness of Cromwell because across 2 centuries he almost physically felt the feebleness and hopelessness of the moderate parliamentarians. He said a word of sympathy for the universally vituperated Jacobins of the Mountain, because through thick veils of national prejudice and misrepresentation, he felt the impossibility of the Gironde. So there you go. I mean, you know, Chesterton was not one to kind of make a cheap portrait of somebody, and I think that anybody who's read Carlyle can sympathize with that. You know, he was he was this kind of, in a sense, this kind of old Scotch bard, you know, who could see, you know, he could see his way into the future. He had a great wisdom to him, and he was, because of that wisdom, he could kind of get inside the minds of the historical characters he was writing about. I mean, you know, we talked on Carlyle Day about how revolutionary Carlylean his history was. You know, he treated it more like a novel than just history. You know, he could work out why Robespierre did the things he did, or why Cromwell had to be so militant. You know, he could get these things. You know, Chesterton also was kind of the English equivalent of that. He was a seer. You know, he saw the same thing.
Does Carlyle's actual thinking directly feed into Chesterton? Does Chesterton go as far as to acknowledge that he read Carlyle and adopted his ideas?
That is a difficult question. Because Thomas, because the answer is he almost certainly did. But at the same time, I doubt it would have been so conscious.
Sure.
Chesterton would have admired Carlyle. It's clear from his writing about Carlyle that he certainly did. But I think Carlyle was too. Chesterton kind of revels in the sensual side of life, if you will. He wants to kind of affirm the goodness of God, whereas Carlyle wants to kind of affirm the perhaps the harsher aspects of life and the kind of the fiery aspects of God, and the kind of the fact that we have small mercies in life at all. You know, he was kind of I mean, if you want to be kind of blunt about it, Chesterton was very Catholic and Carlyle was very Protestant in the kind of characteristic sense of the term. You know, Chesterton would have kind of written great prayers thanking God for the feast on a holy day, whereas Carlyle would have, put his trust in God for sheer, hard work and kind of Protestant austerity, if you will. That's they are. I mean, really, what I have to say about them is that they were both so prolific in their own way that you can't really compare them. Even if Carlyle influenced Chesterton, they're simply their minds individually are too great to really say, well, they were doing this the same or that the same. It really goes beyond them.
Let's dig into the Catholic versus Protestant then. So what was it that led Chesterton to Catholicism?
So, I'm just looking through my notes here because this is again a very big topic.
Yes.
And he wrote, and I'm going to draw from this. He wrote a very important essay called "Why I Am a Catholic," because. So, I mean, a bit of his background. He grew up in a kind of Unitarian household. Sort of, he was baptized into the Church of England, though his family were really sort of irreligious. They weren't really. They of course, it was sort of respectable 1870s sort of society. They had the appearances of the kind of respectable Christians, but they weren't meaningfully Christian. Like I think like a lot of people in this community grew up in households like that. I certainly did. Technically everyone's baptized, but nobody really practices the faith as such. And he wasn't really interested in religion as such as a child. But then he became interested in Anglicanism in 1901 after he married his wife, Frances Blogg. And of course, he kind of went through something that quite a few people did around that time, because it was the height of the so-called Catholic revival in Britain, where a lot of people were basically, they wanted the Anglican Church to be very high church, very, very hierarchical, very formal. And many of them seemed to conclude that, well, we may as well just become Catholic then, because ultimately we want the highest church possible, which essentially is the Roman Church. So they converted. Cardinal Newman, of course, very famous for this.
For people less familiar with that terminology, a high church Anglican service is very similar in appearance to a Catholic service, and then low service Protestantism is as far removed from Catholicism in its kind of aesthetic appearance.
Yes,
you tend to get a lot closer to that, either in a Puritan direction where you have very simple, everything's plain, or in a kind of casual, charismatic, modern sense where you just everyone shows up in jeans and t-shirts and sort of slums it into the pews. Or pews would be an example of a high church.
Yes, plastic chairs.
Yeah.
Or just crates. I don't know. Yes, he kind of, but again, it's. I mean, he became interested in Christianity in 1901, but he didn't enter the church till 1922. So, he didn't take it lightly. He gave this great consideration, and in 1908, I believe, he wrote a book called Orthodoxy. And this book is probably one of the greatest books written in the last few hundred years, and it's never really given the reputation it deserves. I mean, to be honest, I would say that this book did like a large amount of the work in bringing me not only to Christianity but to Catholicism. Quite a few years ago now. It's not explicitly Christian apologetics is the incredible thing about it. He doesn't really frame it in the way you would expect. He makes arguments in favor of religion, and kind of he takes this very personalistic viewpoint of how does a thinking man reconcile himself with the faith. And he basically, he smashes it out of the park completely. And it's really not long either. You can read it in a few hours in an afternoon, but it's an incredible piece of text. Technically, it's a sequel to another book he wrote called Heretics, which he wrote in 1905. And I've read that, but really, Orthodoxy is the incredible one. Anybody who is struggling for, kind of getting their head and their soul around the faith, I would recommend to read this immediately, because it's incredible. It really answers a lot of questions in a very good way. And of course, it's Chesterton, so it's a fun read. It's like he's sort of whimsically talking to you. He's like he's sat in front of you, sort of cigar in hand, brushing off the finer points of Christian orthodoxy. Also, I forgot to mention at the start. You may know Chesterton because, on top of everything else he did in his life, he wrote the Father Brown stories, the very prolific fiction about the Catholic priest's sort of amateur sleuth. That's probably his most thanks Turner his most well-known contribution to sort of popular literature. It's again, he's so many things that anybody who you ask who knows him, what was Chesterton, they'll give you a different answer. Some people say he was a sort of Sherlock Holmesian author who happened to write Christian apologetics on the side. Some people say he was a Christian apologist who wrote short stories on the side. He did everything. He did everything, and he did it very well.
Orthodoxy was also my introduction to Chesterton, and I just when I read it, I thought it was the best thing I'd ever read in my life.
It really is good. We are talking it up a lot, but we really can't do it enough praise here. I mean, it's a fantastic book.
Well, I wonder if perhaps I might read a section of it in my best Chesterton impression.
Go on.
Okay. Modern masters of science are much impressed with the need of beginning all inquiry with a fact. The ancient masters of religion were quite easily impressed with that necessity. They began with the fact of sin, a fact as practical as potatoes. Whether or no man could be washed in miraculous waters, there was no doubt at any rate that he wanted washing. But certain religious leaders in London, not mere materialists, have begun in our day not to deny the highly disputable water, but to deny the indisputable dirt. Certain new theologians dispute original sin, which is the only part of Christian theology which can really be proven. So they have the comparison of potatoes and washing potatoes with man's condition.
Yes.
But then in that image, so perfectly pointing out something true of humanity, the fact that we are like this, this core, the potato, the thing that's valuable, with this dirty, unwanted, sinful problem that needs washing. And then the fact that although different people have proposed different ways of washing the potatoes, the fact that the potato is dirty surely is the obvious thing. And I think similarly, everybody looking at who's ever met a human or interacted with them or looked in their own heart would agree that there is this sin. You can't get away from sin as an observation. It's very much in your face.
Yes, and this is the beautiful thing about Chesterton, is that he looks at all these lofty philosophical problems that we spend all our time arguing about, and he says, well, look at the world around us. The answers are right there in front of us. Like it, he says, like he just read, consider the potato, and you've got your answer. Yeah. It's really incredible.
Like, I would normally present this kind of idea as we have an intuitive sense that there is an objective morality,
Yeah.
something like that.
No,
And he
consider
says
the potato.
they begin with the fact of sin, a fact as practical as potatoes.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, there's a wonderful book. I managed to get AA to read it. It's again not very long. It's just a collection of essays, about 12 or so essays that he wrote for the newspapers, and it's called Tremendous Trifles. And it's just these incredible. Again, it's this thing of he looks around us at the world around us, and he says, "There's the answer." And I think he was a quote of his. He said, "I could write a book just looking out of the window, just looking at things and finding the truth. Because there is, in a sense, there is philosophical truth in everything. If something happens, there's truth in it. If something exists, there's truth in it. And that's what Chesterton saw. That's the incredible eye he had for this kind of thing. And this is less to do with religion, I suppose, but there's an incredible an essay he wrote talking about when he was a young man. I should note he didn't have any kind of formal training in philosophy. He actually went to art school to be an illustrator. He liked drawing cartoons, and so he went to an illustrating school. But he didn't graduate. He became a journalist instead. But anyway, he relates a story about when he was a young man, and it was a wonderful morning. He reluctantly tore himself away from the task of doing nothing in particular. One of those wonderful mornings, and he picked up 6 chalks and some brown paper, and he went off for a walk to draw. And he's going to draw with the chalk on the brown paper, and he went out across the kind of downs of South England, as anybody who's been there knows. They are wonderful places to roam around in the open country, and he was kind of drawing. He was drawing all these things, and he decided to draw a cow that was in a field. And again, I could just read every paragraph is just crammed with beauty and truth. And he says he was going to sketch what is this? That he was going to sketch the landscape. And he talks about the old poets, and he says they were. I'll do the voice. He says,
"Yes,
we're not supposed to care very much about nature because they did not describe it much. They preferred writing about great men to writing about great hills, but they sat on the great hills to write it. They gave out much less about nature, but they drank in perhaps much more. They painted the white robes of their holy virgins with the blinding snow at which they had stared all day. They blazoned the shields of their paladins with the purple and gold of many heraldic sunsets. The greenness of 1,000 green leaves clustered into the live green figure of Robin Hood. The blueness of a score of forgotten skies became the blue robes of the Virgin. The inspiration went in like sunbeams and came out like Apollo." Anyway, he's drawing on the paper, and he realizes that he's forgotten to bring white chalk, and he's incensed about this because, of course, white is such a basic color, and he can't complete the drawing. It looks terrible without the white. And then he says, "I sat on the hill in a sort of despair. There was no town nearer than Chichester at which it was even remotely probable that there would be such a thing as an artist's colourman. And yet, without white, my absurd little pictures would be as pointless as the world would be if there was no good people in it. I stared stupidly round, racking my brains for expedients. Then I suddenly stood up and roared with laughter again and again, so that the cows stared at me and called a committee. Imagine a man in the Sahara regretting that he had no sand for his hourglass. Imagine a gentleman in mid-ocean wishing he had brought some salt water with him for his chemical experiments. I was sitting on an immense warehouse of white chalk. The landscape was made entirely out of white chalk. White chalk was piled more miles until it met the sky. I stooped and broke off a piece of the rock I had sat on. It did not mark so well as shop chalks do, but it gave the effect. And I stood there in a trance of pleasure, realizing that this southern England is not only a grand peninsula, and a tradition, and a civilization. It is something even more admirable. It is a piece of chalk." I'm sitting on the world's largest piece of chalk.
Yes.
What English is,
Wondering why didn't they
where
bring
the white
chalk?
chalk is. Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it?
But there's also that sense that you were talking about of a joie de vivre in his writing. That
Yes,
he has this incredible lust for
he
life
really
that
does.
comes through.
And again, because when I first started reading him, I thought, oh well, this is a bit sort of naive. He's not confronting any sort of miseries of life. How could anyone go around being this bloody happy all the time? And then, of course, you read his work and you realize that he was. I mean, one, he suffered an enormous amount in his personal life. A lot of people, who imagine themselves to be awfully clever, and who don't tend to like Christianity very much, they tend to assume that Christians are sort of naive. That the only reason they're happy is because they haven't had any sort of real misery happen to them. And I think this is a very false and a very sort of pernicious view. Chesterton had many tragedies occur in his life, not the least of which was the death of his beloved brother in the First World War. His wife, unfortunately, was after they married, it was revealed that she unfortunately couldn't bear children. He nearly died during the war as a result of a heart attack. He was always dealing with very sad things, and yet it's a testament to the power of what religion is. I mean, there he was. He could deal with all this and still be the most jolly man you've ever seen. He would. I think it was Franz Kafka briefly met him when Chesterton did a tour of Europe, and Kafka wrote in his diary, "He is so happy. I truly believe he has found God."
Wow.
just the true happiness of someone like Chesterton.
I have to read this section from right at the end of Orthodoxy that talks about joy, because I think it's very telling of his own view of where the joy comes from. So he says, "Joy, which was the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. And as I close this chaotic volume, I again open the small, strange book from which all Christianity came, and I am again haunted by a kind of confirmation. The tremulous figure which fills the Gospels towers in this respect, as in every other, above all thinkers who ever thought themselves tall. His pathos was natural, almost casual. The Stoics, ancient and modern, were proud of concealing their tears. He never concealed his tears. He showed them plainly on his open face at any daily sight, such as the far sight of his native city. Yet he concealed something. Solemn supermen and imperial diplomatists are proud of restraining their anger. He never restrained his anger. He flung furniture down the front steps of the temple, and asked men how they expected to escape the damnation of hell. Yet he restrained something, I say with reverence. There was in that shattering personality a thread that must be called shyness. There was something that he hid from all men when he went up a mountain to pray. There was something that he covered constantly by abrupt silence or impetuous isolation. There was some one thing that was too great for God to show us when he walked upon our earth. And I have sometimes fancied that it was his mirth."
Incredible, isn't it?
Such writing.
Such a great mind. I mean,
Yeah.
Before I forget, so first of all, I wanted to bring up a point about GK Chesterton and Catholic philosophy. But before I do that, before I forget this, of course, it is Holy Week.
Yes.
So very, very timely to do this stream. And Chesterton, one of his more famous poems is called "The Donkey." And I'm sure I don't need to elucidate to the audience the symbolic importance of the donkey to Christians, and especially to at this time of year, of course, the animal that bore Christ into the city. And he wrote a poem, and it goes like it's a short poem. It just goes, "When forests walked and fishes flew, and figs grew upon thorn, some moment when the moon was blood, then surely I was born. With monstrous head and sickening bray, and ears like errant wings, the devil's walking parody of all four-footed things, the battered outlaw of the earth, of ancient crooked will, scourge, beat. To deride me, I am dumb, I keep my secret still. Fools, for I also had my hour, one far fierce hour and sweet. There was a shout around my head, and palms around my feet." Very, very simple, but very powerful. This idea that it's the kind of, on its own, it's kind of the lowest sort of ridiculous, sort of ugly creature, and yet it was that which bore Christ into the city. With
it's funny that you should bring that up, because I, as you might have picked up, every stream over Lambster, I'm having a short verse at the end, so we're kind of running through the Passion narrative over these streams. And it so happens that the passage I had planned for the end of this stream involves the donkey. So there's something to look forward to at the end of the stream.
Yes. And so again, back to this kind of the whole, I mean, I'd say this is less of a Catholic point and more of a general Christian one, I suppose. But so when I was beginning to consider religion and Christianity, of course, I don't think it would be false to say that I've always been a kind of thinking type, always into sort of philosophy and the arts and everything. And of course, I thought, well, I can't really commit to a religion if I feel that the philosophy is false. And of course, Chesterton is always making this point. And this was perhaps the most powerful thing which drew me to the faith, is that the church is a kind of maybe I'll give it a go. But the church is a kind of 2,000-year-old brain, basically, and that these great problems in the modern age, which we concern ourselves with, the church answered these problems 2,000 years ago. We did all. We've been through all this. We've argued about the purpose of man and woman, and sort of why we should prohibit certain things and why we should allow certain other things, and the place of people in society, and the kind of rules of how men should be governed. We've done all this. We all this stuff in the modern age where we think we're the first ones to do it. We aren't. It's all been done before. It's all happened before, and the church is basically the nearest thing we have. It is to the absolute truth. It's he says. I'm trying to find the quote now. He says the church discussed everything so long ago that the people have forgotten the discussion. It's and again, that's when I realized, there isn't any point spending your life arguing about many of these things, because the church paid to these. Like that's it ushered in an era of great truth and great harmony, basically. In my opinion,
for an intellectually minded person, I think it takes some humility to accept that that the answers have already been found for the key questions you're wrestling with. It feels like surely I should not be in agreement with anybody, but I should strike out on my own. Find conclusions that are brand new. And
it's well, do you really think you're going to do that after brains for 2,000 years have toiled over these questions?
But we're so used to being told repeatedly that that there's a revolution happening in our midst, technologically, intellectually, and everything's going to be upturned, and in a way that's what the title refers to, orthodoxy, the orthodox position that in fact is that not I should find the passage from the beginning. He talks about taking a boat and sailing away from
the wonderful bit about I'm tempted to read it if we have time.
Do it. Yeah, let's find
it.
All right.
Yes, about getting off on a boat to explore and then
This is funny
landing.
because this is an example of something that was buried deep in my own consciousness. That
Yes.
I was saying this, just a second ago, and then it occurred to me I probably originally came to this conclusion from reading Chesterton.
Indeed. Yes, here we go. So, I've often had a fancy for writing a romance about an English yachtsman who slightly miscalculated his course and discovered England under the impression it was a new island on the South Seas. I always find, however, that I am either too busy or too lazy to write this fine work, so I may as well give it away for the purposes of philosophical illustration. There will probably be a general impression that the man who landed, armed to the teeth and talking by signs, to plant the British flag on that barbaric temple, which turned out to be the pavilion at Brighton, rather felt a fool. I am not here concerned to deny that he looked a fool. But if you imagine that he felt a fool, or at any rate that the sense of folly was his soul or his dominant emotion, then you have not studied with sufficient delicacy the rich romantic nature of the hero of this tale. His mistake was really a most enviable mistake, and he knew it, if he was the man I take him for. What could be more delightful than to have in the same few minutes all the fascinating terrors of going abroad, combined with the humane security of coming home again? What could be better than to have all the fun of discovering South Africa without the disgusting necessity of landing there? What could be more glorious than to brace oneself up to discover New South Wales, then realize with a gush of happy tears that it was really Old South Wales? This at least seems to me to be the main problem for philosophers, and is in a manner the main problem of this book. How can we contrive to be at once astonished at the world and yet at home in it? How can this queer cosmic town, with its many-legged citizens, with its monstrous and ancient lamps, how can this world give us at once the fascination of a strange town and the comfort and honor of being our own town?
It's incredible to be so funny, and but also to genuinely affect how you think deeply about things.
Absolutely.
But perhaps there should be no surprise in that at all, because after all, the laugh is almost the laughter of recognition.
Yes.
It's like the similarity between a laughter of humor and a laughter of like surprise of seeing something that you kind of had already seen before, or in a new light, or something like this.
Well, I mean, it's as he says, the simultaneous joy of thinking you'd landed at New South Wales, and the simultaneous comfort of knowing you landed in Old South Wales. It's a wonderful turn of phrase, isn't it?
I wonder if there's a particular delight in the fact that he's writing with. I don't know if this is I only really speak English, so I don't know if this is a peculiar thing to our language. But there's this way of living right in that pocket between formality and informality, where you can kind of it's. And I think we'll see a similar thing with. I'm talking with George Valbian right after this about John Bunyan, and I feel a similar thing there, where there's kind of a delight in using the different registers of English that you can transcend. You're kind of taking great pains to present yourself well with airs and graces of proper English grammar, but what you're communicating is fundamentally kind of whimsical and silly. It's almost a contrast going on.
It's a real skill. It doesn't come easily. This is true literary talent. This is the as a writer myself, I can tell you that Chesterton is like the equivalent of being like Peter Paul Rubens, of being a painter. It's the utmost God-given talent. If any man had reason to be thankful to the Lord for what he was given, it was Chesterton. I mean, incredible skill. I just want to bring up something that is often neglected, especially among this community, is that we tend not to read novels at all. we tend to stick only to kind of philosophy and essays and nonfiction. We'll occasionally, if we're lucky, we'll get them to read a bit of poetry, but we neglect novels entirely. And I think this is a great problem, because the reason is I want to read a bit from the end of Chesterton's book, The Man Who Was Thursday. Thank you, Poe. But yes, because, go on, sir.
Well, I was going to say Poe's other point. This observation from Oren McIntyre that that it's a thing that seems to be happening at the moment, where people have, I suppose you could argue, starting in the 60s, gone on this kind of quest.
The disgusting quest.
Let's throw away all of the arbitrary moral standards that we picked up, presumably from stupid ancient religion, and figure out our own new type of sexuality. And they've kind of tried all this stuff, and as you say, with tragic and loathsome effect. But they've circled around and come back and rediscovered that the kind of God's given plan for our lives actually made a lot of logical sense and wasn't as arbitrary as it originally appeared.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's this. It makes me so angry and so frustrated a lot of the time. This the fact that we live in this age where all these people with quite considerable power in their brains, and also people with no power at all, go on and on and on about this and that and this and that, and it's we've done that. We're doing this again. It's that people these days don't realize the ridiculousness of humanity as a race. I think as a species. I mean, you can't help but laugh. When you look at all this. The fact that we did this 2,000 years ago and we're doing it again now. I think I know that a lot of people tend to be quite black-pilled, but I do have a sense of optimism in a way, because 2,000 years ago, all the same problems that we have now happened then, and they concluded that basically, spiritual, wholesome, moralist religion was the way to go. And it's not. It's fairly likely we could make the same conclusion again at some point. Who'd
have thought you'd be the bearer of the white pill?
Well, I mean, but the thing is, I am fundamentally not a doomer, because no true Christian can be a doomer, because ultimately, if everything is in the hands of God, you do have an eternal hope. And I want to get onto this if we have time later. Again, the brilliant bit about Chesterton when he talks about the good news of the gospel. And he said that, well, the reason that the gospel spread so quickly without force in most cases was that because it is genuinely good news. Who can resist the fact that Christ triumphed over death? Death has been triumphed over. You can't really say no to that. When you have it as the truth, as the good news. The news has been spread over the world.
I mean, in some sense, the ultimate enemy, death, is like it's the expression of entropy. First in the life of one body, right? You've got the you are born ordered, and your body decays over time and eventually dies, and then ultimately you could see the death of larger things, nations, and the projections forwards in kind of modern science is we will have the heat death of the universe.
Yes.
And there just seems to be no escaping. If you're trapped within a material system, you've got to reckon with death as the inevitable future. And that's exactly what Christ did, was to beat death and to find a solution for it. And in the same way, yes, as Christians, you can say, well, yes, all of the mechanisms point to take the black pill, and yet we have this potential miraculous intervention that can break the process.
Yes, and I mean, Chesterton. I have to find it now. Chesterton wrote a response to T.S. Elliot's *The Wasteland*, and of course, Elliott. I don't want to talk. I'm a big fan of Elliott, of course, another great Christian poet. But at one time, he had a feud with Chesterton because he was so because Elliott was an extreme pessimist, and of course, famously, I believe it's in The Wasteland, Elliott has the line, ending not with a bang, but with a whimper, which is kind of passed into English as a general expression now. And Chesterton responded with, and again, I always think this whenever I'm discussing kind of with a non-Christian or a hardcore sort of a materialist in some way. I think some sneer, some snigger, some simper in the youth where we laughed and sang, and they may end with a whimper, but we will end with a bang.
Yes,
It's the optimism. It's and again, everybody talks optimism down. You don't have to be a kind of generalized optimist. I don't have any optimism for, say, the next 100 years of Western civilization at all. But it doesn't mean that I don't have optimism in a metaphysical sense. And really, that's what keeps me going. I mean, this is probably a very stark sounding thing to say, but I mean it. Is that if I ever was truly convinced there was no God, I wouldn't really see a reason to keep on living.
Yeah.
Why?
I agree, and in a weird way, I think there's a sense in which people live, whether they admit it or not, as though there were a God.
Certainly.
That was the Peterson line, wasn't it? Recently,
Mm-hmm.
he says, "Oh, do you believe in God?" Well, I live as if there were a God. I think to some degree that's everybody. Even the most avowed atheist, if they keep going, they're living a contradiction.
Exactly. It's like there's a wonderful quote. I don't know who wrote it, but it's become sort of a meme, but I think it is basically true. And it says the correct moral. It's the correct counter argument to an active nihilist is to shoot them. I mean, really, by their own logic,
There's a saying that there are no atheists in foxholes.
Yes,
but when we really
you're an atheist till the plate starts crashing.
Yeah, but if you really think about your situation, we're all in a foxhole of one sort or another.
I mean, people. I think there's something about modern life in the last sort of 50 years has convinced people that they're kind of untouchable. That as if as if we have complete choice over what happens to us. And it's like I was discussing this with Mr. D about a year ago. Is that I was talking about this event in 1816 called the Year Without a Summer, where a volcano erupted in Indonesia, and the ash cloud was so great that it covered Europe completely for the duration of the summer. So there was no summer that year. The winter continued for the whole year, and it caused, of course, undue chaos and suffering because, of course, it meant that large amounts of crops didn't mature and couldn't be eaten, and all sorts of horrible things happened. I think of the Athenian plague or the Spanish flu, which is within living memory still, technically, for some people. Anything like that. I mean, people forget how fragile material existence is. It's, and I think Chesterton and I think to be a Christian, you have to be really aware of that. You have to know that it could all go at any minute because ultimately it's not up to us. It's up to the supreme being. It's up to God. It's the whole. I call it the project of arrogance, which has happened over the past few hundred years, where men have proclaimed man to be in the place of God, that man is divine, that man is in charge. And it really it's a grave heresy, and one that will result and has resulted in much suffering, I think. Yes.
Little black flag there.
Raising the black flag.
I wonder if you could perhaps just choose one or two more Chesterton quotes as we bring the stream towards its conclusion.
I just wanted to read this bit from his book, The Man Who Was Thursday, because it has significance for us, and it will be it's not very long either, but it'll be a very funny book to read for us now, because of course we always love to talk about feds, don't we? And the fact that we might be getting infiltrated and being listened in and stuff. And so, I mean, this is sort of a spoiler, but it doesn't really spoil too much. Is that so? The basic plot of The Man Who Is Thursday is that a policeman. Well, first of all, it was published in about 1902, and it's set 100 years in the future where nothing has changed. Basically, the first joke is that it's 100 years in the future. It's 2001. But the world is exactly the same as it was in 1902 because everybody chose consciously not to listen to great philosophers and thinkers of the time. They all chose not to listen to the intellectuals, so everything stayed the same, and they're all living quite happily. And it's about a policeman called Gabriel Syme, who takes the name Thursday, hence the title, and he infiltrates a group of anarchists. And all these anarchists, the whole point is that they have names which correspond to the days of the week. So you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc. He is Thursday, and there is a man who is the president of the Society of Anarchists. Unfortunately for us, he's called President Sunday, and the guy who AA is enemies with, President Sunday, he takes his name from this book. Unfortunately, yes, and it's revealed that in fact, again, this is very true to life. It happens quite a lot in America, especially with the FBI, that every single member of this anarchist movement is an undercover policeman.
Amazing.
This is revealed before even the halfway point of the book. Everybody is just a policeman in this thing.
What a premise.
Except President Sunday, right? And this is where the book gets into its kind of Christian apologetics, right? Because you get this thing happening towards the end. You get this moment. So that it's revealed that everybody is a policeman, and the protagonist gives this speech, and he turns to President Sunday and goes, "And you," said Syme, leaning forward, "what are you?" "I? What am I?" roared the president, and he rose slowly to an incredible height, like some enormous wave about to arch above them and break. "You want to know what I am, do you? Mr. Bull, you are a man of science. Grub in the roots of those trees and find out the truth about them. Syme, you are a poet. Stare at those morning clouds. But I tell you this, that you will have found out the truth of the last tree and the topmost cloud before the truth about me. You will understand the sea, and I shall still be a riddle. You shall know what the stars are and not know what I am. Since the beginning of the world, all men have hunted me like a wolf, kings and sages and poets and lawgivers, all the churches, all the philosophers, but I have never been caught yet. And the skies will fall in the time I turn to bay. I have given them a good run for their money, and I will now." Before one of them could move, the monstrous man had swung himself up like some huge orangutan over the balustrade of the balcony. Yet before he dropped, he pulled himself up again, as on a horizontal bar, and thrusting his great chin over the edge of the balcony, said, "There's one thing I'll tell you, though, about who I am. I am the man in the dark room who made you all policemen." So I think it's rather obvious the voice that is coming through there from President Sunday, and a rumination on the nature of God, I think,
Amazing. Well, I'm trying to diligently stick to making these streams an hour long each. So unfortunately, our time is gone.
Yeah. Any more funny, humorous anecdotes about Chesterton I can squeeze in, or?
If you can do one in 60 seconds, I'll make special dispensation.
Well, I know that Chesterton... All right, I'll do this really quickly. Chesterton shared a club around 1907 with Winston Churchill, when Winston Churchill was a rising liberal politician. And Chesterton was sat in the corner of the bar, as he liked to, drinking a bottle of wine. And Winston Churchill came over to him. And of course, Chesterton being a very large fellow, Churchill had made a joke. He said, "GK, I do believe you are pregnant." And Chesterton kind of smiled and laughed and sort of, yes. And then and Churchill carried on. He went, "And when it's born, the baby, what are you going to call it?" And Chesterton said, "Well, if it's a boy, I suppose I shall call it Arthur, because I like that name. If it's a girl, I'll call it Anne, after Anne of Cleves, who I admire. And if I suspect it's all piss and wind, I'll call it Winston."
Very good, very good.
Yes.
Well, thank you once again for joining me. That was fantastic. And as promised, today's or this stream's section of the Passion narrative is related to the donkey. So here we are. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt tied by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!"